Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all so very much for being with us today for our budget briefing. We want to welcome our committee clerk, Ms. Kathy Jackson, who's with us. Thank you so very much. And Kathy, at this time, we'll do a roll call, please. Yes. Oh, I don't see it.
What's down here?
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
This is President 27, so they got
Well, thank you. Again, everyone, welcome to the 2025 session overview of the amendments to the FY 2024-2026 budget. At this time, we'll turn it over to Ms. Ann Oman.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad y'all are finally back in town. All the chairman has on the agenda today is the PowerPoint, but there is also a blue folder for all of you at your seats, which has the standard information. It has the subcommittee assignments and meetings times. There are no changes from last year, but just a refresher so you know when to show up for your subcommittee meetings. Although we are doing that incorrectly this afternoon, we have two subcommittees who do not usually meet on Monday afternoon, but will be meeting HHR immediately following the full committee, and then immediately following the adjournment of HHR, we have compensation and retirement. There's also the calendar for the committee activities. The most important item in there in the short run is the February 2nd. Sunday is the budget report out day. The chairman has scheduled that for 1 p.m. on Sunday the 2nd, so please keep your calendars clear for that, and we should be busy late in the week with some extra meetings leading up to that, finalizing your actions on the budget. There's also a sheet on the committee procedures for acting on legislations, as well as a listing of the staff area responsibilities in case you need to check on who you would ask questions to. I guess with that, we'll move to the PowerPoint. Obviously, we're going over the governor's proposed amendments to the budget, which are encased in House Bill 1600. I'll go over the resources and give kind of a big picture overview, and then each of the staff will walk through the secretarial areas. Starting with the funding that was available from the 2024 surplus. As you know, the budget was adopted late last year, so Chapter 2, we were well aware that you're going to have a substantial surplus. So most of that money was allocated as contingent spending based on the surplus. All of the contingent items are fully achievable with the amount of resources that were available at year end, but you do have to actually appropriate those funds. So included in the resources before you is just under $1.2 billion from the FY 2024 surplus. The items listed between the two bold lines here are all the allocations that you made in Chapter 2, but again, you would have to actually appropriate those this year for them to go into effect. Of the $1.2 billion surplus, that left about $155 million, which the governor has spent on other activities throughout. So one chunk of the resources for you is the $1.2 billion from the surplus. The next largest chunk, or the largest chunk of all, is of course the adjustments to the revenue forecast. Because FY24 grew more than had been assumed when the budget was passed, that means the growth rates you use to measure growth in fiscal year 25 go against a higher base. That gives you additional money in and of itself. So to support all the appropriations you made last year, revenues could actually decrease in the current fiscal year. So you're at no risk of having to unappropriate any amounts from last year. From an economic perspective, they have also revised the economic outlook. Not hugely robust. It's modest economic growth throughout the rest of the biennium, but the first year is anticipated to be much stronger than the second year. They've increased the Revenue growth to about 4.1% in FY 2025. And this is compared to last year's assumption that we would be in the midst of a recession at this time. So you pick up a good bit of money from that change. The percentage growth in FY 2026 is actually decreased, but because you're operating on 2 years of higher of a base, it still does produce additional revenues in the second year. So in total, you have about $3.3 billion in additional general funds from the revenue forecast changes itself. $2.1 billion of that is in the first year, $1.2 billion in the second year. And as you're all probably quite aware, that does mean that you need to focus a lot of the one-time money on one-time activities from the first year. And the only thing you can entirely safely project as ongoing resources is that second year amount of $1.2 billion. We are seeing growth well in excess of the forecast year to date. You will receive the revenue report for December next week, but through November, revenues were up 7.3% compared to fiscal year 2024. This slide simply shows the growth in revenues by sources for your reference. Overall, you're seeing fairly strong growth in net individual income in the current year, lower growth in sales tax, some contraction in corporate income. The others are in their typical range, although you're seeing a bit of a bump back in recordation taxes as the length of the high interest rates has resulted in a slight uptick in refi, and people still have to move, so you're seeing sales volumes increase, again, not dramatically, but moving upwards. And all of those forecasts are a bit lower in the second year. In addition to the adjustments from the surplus in 2024 and the revenue forecast adjustments for this current year, you also have some adjustments to the transfer of non-general funds to the general fund. Net, it's only about $50 million. I'll just point out a couple items on here. There's an additional transfer out of the revenue reserve fund to the general fund of $203 million in the first year. This is reflective of the cap of the combined amount of money that can be in the rainy day fund and the revenue reserve fund. So you're putting in $288 million from the 2024 surplus and then immediately turning around and taking out $203 million just to not bump over the combined 15% cap. There are some increases in the transfer to K-12 that just reflect the updated sales tax forecast. You'll recall last year you put a good bit of money into ABC in the first year to correct what was a very optimistic revenue forecast. You knew that 26 would still be a problem, and the governor has addressed it in the introduced bill, reducing the assumed revenues from ABC by about $75 million in the second year. There's also the elimination of revenue that had been assumed from games of skill. That was included in the budget, and then the legislation was subsequently vetoed, so that revenue will no longer be available. Again, just to say a little bit more about the reserve fund, you'll see the deposit going into the fund, the transfers out of the fund that were assumed last year, and then the additional transfer out that I just mentioned. But in essence, you'll have $4.2 billion at the end of the biennium, and you're up at that 15% cap. You had allowed the amounts to go higher in the previous biennium, and then last year there was a move to get more in line with the code stipulated cap. So you'll see that it decreases from 18.2 in 24 down to 7.5 in 25, and the budget restates that 15% cap for fiscal year 2026. In terms of wrapping all of these together, that means you have about $4.7 billion in total of new resources available for your consideration in House Bill 1600. There are also some tax policy proposals contained in the governor's budget. I will walk through those. I'll talk about the car tax credit proposal on the next slide in a little bit more detail, but we'll point out that that does not have a resource adjustment in this budget because the way the governor handled that was to make a cash deposit into a non-reverting fund that is intended to cover the appropriation cost of that program in 26, 27, and 28. So that does not show up as a revenue adjustment, but an expenditure. Most of the other tax policy proposals don't have a big dollar amount associated with them. The next largest would be the proposal to eliminate tax on tips. Language is included in the budget to do that, and there's also standalone legislation that has been introduced that's in House Finance that will be considered. That has a half-year impact in the current biennium, so would reduce revenues by $35 million in the first year. That's expected to about double beginning in FY 2027. The other items are fairly small dollar in nature. I'm happy to talk about them in more detail if anyone has interest separately. Before moving away from tax policy, I will mention, again, something that will be handled in House Finance, but there is a proposal to require multi-state corporations to use market-based sourcing, which would be a large shift. It, again, does not have an impact in this biennium, but is expected to cost the Commonwealth beginning in 27 and 28, with the expectation that as out-of-state corporations that currently don't file in Virginia would come into compliance, that it could be a positive generator of revenues starting in about FY 2029. But it is a big public policy shift, and because you're talking about revenue you would generate from people who aren't currently filing taxes, there's some concern about the level of detail on those estimates because it's hard to know what you don't know. Just to give you a little bit more detail on the car tax credit, since that is solely in the budget and is an appropriation action, there's language in Part 4 that would create a refundable tax credit based on car taxes paid that would be effective for taxable years beginning on January 1, 2025. For individual filers, it would be a maximum of $150 or the amount of car taxes paid by that individual, the lesser of the two. And for joint filers, it would be double that amount, $300, or the amount of car tax paid. The appropriation to support the first 3 years of this program is contained under the Department of Accounts transfer payment items, and it's $1.1 billion that's appropriated in 2025. Language making those amounts non-reverting so that they would be available for that purpose going forward. That was expected to cover the cost of the program 26 through 28. And then the annual cost of that beginning in 2029 starts at about $377 million. In terms of spending actions in the budget, they do total $4.7 billion. Operating expenditures make up about $3.3 billion of that total. And just to give you a sense of scale, two amendments, the Car Tax Relief Fund and the Medicaid reforecast, make up over half of all of the new spending. In addition to the operating amendments, there's $1.4 billion in capital outlay cash for capital projects. Again, all of that has been placed in fiscal year 2025. The spending proposed by the governor is heavily weighted towards one-time actions, which total $3.4 billion out of the $4.7 billion, just leaving $1.3 billion in recurring program spending. And the unappropriated balance is $14.8 million at the close of the biennium. This slide highlights the top 13 spending items in the budget, all of which are $50 million above, and they make about 80% of the total operating expenditures. So you can get a good overall sense of where the money goes just looking at this one slide. And if there aren't any big picture questions, I will hand it over to Susan Massart to start with Health and Human Resources.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. First of all, just want to tell you that House Bill 1600 contains a net increase of about $858 million over the biennium for Health and Human Services. About 92% of that new funding is driven by mandated programs, such as the Medicaid expenditure forecast and backfilling the loss of Virginia Healthcare Fund revenue the first year. The state children's health insurance programs, famous in MCHIP, CSA caseload and cost increases. There are some other programs in DBHDS and DSS that are listed on that page, and Amy will go through those when we get there. Just in terms of your DMAS forecasts, this just illustrates for you the each year the amounts for the official forecast, the adjustment for the Virginia Healthcare Fund. You see there the second line. And then you see the forecasts for the children's health insurance programs. Those are going up. When we did a lot of the Medicaid eligibility redetermination, more children shifted into those children's health insurance programs as they lost eligibility due to income. And then the involuntary mental commitment fund is declining slightly. Just in terms of Medicaid policy and administrative changes, these are listed on this slide in your packet. These are mostly small amounts. There's a couple things to point out to you. There's a new waiver program for serious mental illness. This will allow the state to get a better match rate for individuals to stay longer in private acute care settings, up to 60 days. There is a new reserve fund created in the Medicaid agency for new initiatives, and I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. It's about $1 million set aside. And then just coming down to the fourth line there, it says cover pre-release Medicaid services for justice-involved youth. This is a federal requirement, a new waiver program to do pre-release services and a little bit into bringing them out of their incarcerated status. Skipping to the next slide, Children's Services Act. You might remember that Chapter 2 provided about $48 million each year for increases in caseload and cost increases in the CSA program. The governor's introduced bill, HB 1600, provides an additional $37 million in the first year and $68 million in the second year for those cost increases. So together, they provide an additional $200 million plus for CSA over the biennium. That represents about a 27% increase in the program. Right now, we've seen caseload increases of about 6% over the last fiscal year. It's running about 13.5% now in the first 6 months. Expenditures over what you put in last year are expected to increase by about 11% in 25 and 9.5% in 26. Again, primarily, though, due to expenditure increases in special ed private day placements, which comprise about 44% of CSA year-to-date expenditures. The introduced budget does contain limits on the growth in state reimbursement for the cost of private day services to 2.5% beginning in fiscal year 2026. This was a mechanism we used a number of years ago that we lifted in more recent years. The Virginia Health Department, there's not a lot of spending there. Just want to point out a couple of things there. Funding for the Perinatal Health Hub pilot program of $2.5 million. There's about 15 additional staff for state drinking water compliance activities of about 1.6. And then skipping down to the fourth line there, they did put up some additional funding for community health workers and doulas at local health departments, about 8 to 10 positions depending on the combination. And you will remember you put in $3.2 million each year for to backfill what was used with ARPA money to fund community health workers in local health departments. So that's already out there. And then just finally at the bottom of the page, there's a proposal to increase the fee for expediting vital records from $48 to $53 in 2026. This is for people that need to get that vital record like ASAP next day. This is mainly postage costs of doing FedEx or whatever of those. The language that I had alluded to a little bit earlier ago has to do with the waiver program for short-term acute stays in psych hospitals. That's in there in Medicaid, and it adds language to carry over those funds. And then there's the Medicaid Reserve Fund. And what this does realistically is if you were to adopt a new initiative this session and the funding was just in 2026, you would set aside that annual amount. and put it in that reserve fund so that it's already there for the base budget of the next biennium. And that's pretty much that. And then there's some language in the deaf and hard of hearing, which has them report on the anticipated transfer from the TTY technology to real-time text technology in terms of digital communications. I'll turn it over to Amy.
So turning to behavioral health, DBHDS received a little over $54 million general fund over the biennium. The largest amendment is 35.2 the second year in order to develop a new initiative to provide funding to private hospitals to hire special conservators of the peace, or SCOPs, in order to maintain custody of an individual under an emergency custody or temporary detention order. There's $4.6 million general fund to fund 22 positions for developmental disability services and quality assurance positions, including nurse care consultants and dental staff. There's $3.3 million the second year in order to address the cost of rising pharmaceutical costs. This includes long-acting injectables at state facilities. There's also $2.4 million general fund the second year in order to provide salary increases to trades positions at state facilities. This includes electricians, plumbers, construction, and other skilled labor. Moving on, there's $1.5 million general fund the second year in DBHDS to support 2 adult psychiatric access line hubs at hospitals. And this would allow primary care physicians more resources to better treat patients with mental health or substance use disorders. There's $1.5 million general fund the second year for Part C early intervention services. This provides services for infants and toddlers with disabilities. There's $1.2 million general fund the second year to create 2 local crisis co-response teams. This is pursuant to the Marcus Alert legislation. And lastly, there's $1 million general fund in the first year to create an educational campaign to alert youth to the negative impacts of social media and mental health and substance use. And I believe the campaign will be implemented through social media as well as other community resources. Turning to the Department of Social Services, there's $8 million general fund over the biennium to enhance child protective services. This includes improvements to the CPS hotline interactive voice response system, as well as more support to local department staff. There's $7.3 million general fund and $6.5 million non-general fund to fund more increases in the employment and income verification for benefits contract. There's $1.5 million general fund and $1.4 million non-general fund in order to increase the foster care and adoption cost of living adjustment. This will increase maximum payments for foster care families and adoption assistance by 3%. And the next 2 bullets simply show changes in recent expenditure trends for the child welfare forecast, as well as the TANF and VIEW child care forecast. And with that, I will turn it over to Zach for K-12.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. In K-12 and early childhood, House Bill 1600 proposes a $286.5 million general fund increase over the biennium. That's a 1.4% increase from Chapter 2. About 2/3 of the proposed additional funds are for policy proposals. About 1/3 of those are for technical updates. Also, the Governor's proposed budget includes a $290 million increase for school construction grants funded through casino revenues and a literary fund transfer. So those nearly $90 million in technical updates, $111 million of that is an increase for English learner teacher positions. That's resulting from improved school division compliance with English proficiency screening requirements following the passage of legislation last year that tied those staffing standards to English proficiency. $38 million, there's a $38 million increase from the net impact of the increased sales tax projection, as well as the corresponding decrease to the state basic aid funding required. There's also an increase in enrollment projections. These increases were offset by about $93 million in savings resulting from additional lottery proceeds and program participation updates. The school construction grants, there's a $290 million increase proposed. $150 million of that is from a transfer from the literary fund. The remaining amounts come from unappropriated FY24 casino revenues, as well as increases to the revenue forecast for casino revenues. $50 million is proposed for the to establish the Virginia Opportunity Scholarships Program that will provide $5,000 grants to eligible low-income students to attend Virginia private schools. And $25 million is proposed for lab schools, expanding that effort to Virginia public and private HBCUs. $61 million is proposed in the first year and $5 million in the second year to support the costs of transitioning to a new SOL assessment contract. And $50 million is proposed for funds that would be distributed based on the Board of Education's determination among several uses that are listed here, ranging from supports for struggling schools to establishing some statewide IT platforms like an attendance dashboard, a career planning dashboard, as well as enhancements to the state's IEP system. $1.9 million is proposed in FY25 and $3.1 million in 26. That's proposed to continue access to the VVAS following the expiration of pandemic relief funds. VVAS is a data analytics tool available to schools and parents to analyze testing data over time. There's also funds proposed for regional academic support specialists to support struggling schools. And finally, there's a proposal to adjust the agency staffing level, an increase of 32 positions to reflect actual staffing levels. For early childhood, there's no additional funding included in HB 1600, but there's several actions proposed to address access to early childhood slots. The first is the proposal to increase family co-payments from the current average of about 2% of family income to about 7% of family income. It also imposes a $5 co-payment for families that are living below the federal poverty limit. There's a proposal to eliminate the 0.5 LCI cap that's applicable to the Virginia Preschool Initiative. That saves $7.9 million, which would be diverted to establish additional subsidy slots in FY26. Some VPI savings in FY25, about $5.2 million, are proposed to divert to child care subsidy slots for the current fiscal year. And there's also some other actions include imposing a 90-day limit on job searching as an eligible activity for parents to qualify for services, as well as ending new enrollments in the child care subsidy program for school-aged children and establishing a work group to address other ways to serve that age group outside of the subsidy program. And just as a reminder, there are additional 2,500 slots already baked into Chapter 2 that would come online in FY26. That concludes K-12 and early childhood, and now I'll hand it over to Tony. Thank you.
In the area of higher education, there's about $54 million of new spending that is proposed. About half of that is in SHEV with 3 different items, $12 million for a to-be-determined set of initiatives to expand the number of graduates in nursing. There's $12.9 million that would increase the stipends for the VMSDEP eligible students, and about $3.5 million also for the workforce grants. In the community colleges, there's $15 million to support technical education training, and there's also language that would transfer $20 million from the G3 program for the same purpose. There is $5 million at Old Dominion in the first year only for a new initiative related to student pathways, and $4 million in the first year only at VCU for the Massey Cancer Center. In terms of any language amendments, there is a proposed freeze in 2026 on the tuition and fee increases. And then there's language that would impose a 2.5% cap going forward. Of course, the budget would no longer be in effect at that point. There's language for the New College Institute to require a sustainability study, but there's also language in that same place that says that it won't be funded from fiscal 26 going forward. And then lastly, there is a proposed use of $60 million a year in fund balances from the prepaid 529 programs. This doesn't expand any of the waiver programs, but it would reimburse the colleges, and I'm not sure if there's any proposed legislation to actually transfer the money itself. It's all done in the budget language. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kim.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Moving on to the world of commerce and labor. The introduced budget includes $1.4 million for the first payment to Micron for the company's recent MEI-approved project. HB 2358, carried by you, Mr. Chairman, will codify the terms of this economic development deal. Additionally, there is $3.9 million to make Wythe County whole for investments they made at Progress Park for Blue Star Manufacturing. VEDP is under an MOU with the county and required to pay them for these costs. As you all aware, there's an additional $50 million in the introduced budget for business-ready sites managed by VEDP. The $20 million of funding that you all provided to them last year in FY26 was moved by the Department of Planning and Budget to the first fiscal year FY25. So those funds are already obligated. Language in the Part 4 of the budget allows this to happen. And this has happened twice since the creation of this program, and has really made it challenging to establish a base and consistent funding over time for this initiative. The introduced bill creates a permanent disaster assistance fund. Budget language outlining the parameters of this program excludes details on who eligible recipients are for these funds and qualifying events. It's capitalized with $25 million of general fund and remaining Reggie balances estimated at $102 million. It also includes a proposal to invest $15 million to construct daycare facilities by awarding grants to higher education institutions and local governments. Last year, you all invested $90 million in life science research initiatives at 4 institutions: UVA, VCU, ODU, and Virginia Tech. This was structured as a 5-year commitment to these various initiatives. The introduced budget bill makes these investments one time. In addition, there's $35 million of new money for life sciences for projects in Roanoke, Charlottesville, and Petersburg. There's about $5 million to capitalize a new incentive at the Virginia Tourism Authority dedicated to recruiting sports tournaments and events to the state. $2.1 million at Virginia Works, which is the new workforce agency created a couple years ago to market a new jobs posting platform. And then $645,000 to support tourism projects in Southwest Virginia. Turning it over to David.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. Moving on to Ag and Natural Resources. In this world, the most substantial budget actions included in the introduced budget were the disposition of the WQIF deposit from the Part A and Part B surpluses. Collectively, these total $93.7 million in the second year. The largest portion of this is $50 million directed toward the City of Richmond's CSO project. $26.4 million is directed to the WQIF, including both a WQIF reserve deposit as well as a deposit to support ag BMPs. And then finally, $17 million is provided to DEQ to support wastewater treatment plant improvements across the Commonwealth. At DCR, the largest item would reflect the addition of conservation officers to Valors. This is related to legislation that was approved last session that requires reenactment this year. Further, there's just over $300,000 the second year to support 2 additional positions in the Division of Planning and Recreation Resources, and then a handful of positions proposed to be supported using special funds listed at the bottom of the slide. At DEQ, there's $1.5 million directed towards the town of Richlands to support regional wastewater treatment plant improvements. There are 2 smaller NGF adjustments and a language amendment proposing to undo the changes made last session to the delay in the polystyrene container prohibition. Other natural resources agencies at Wildlife Resources, $4.4 million has been included as the state portion to match federal resources for a U.S. Army Corps of Engineer project to build a permanent seabird nesting habitat down there at HRBT, near HRBT. At DHR, there's $250,000 included to support outside legal counsel to help assist with the backlog they're experiencing in the processing of battlefield easements, and $150,000 at VMRC to support upgrades at their main offices. Moving on to Ag and Forestry at VDAX, 2.9 has been included to help ongoing modernization efforts for the department's regulatory system. A number of them are really antiquated by technology standards, and this is for the first 2 of their 21 required system updates that will be rolling out over the next decade. $600,000 has been included for the department to begin implementing an inspection process for EV vehicle chargers through their weights and measures activities. And then $250,000 has been proposed to begin reimbursing livestock producers for their premium payments under a USDA program. And finally, at Forestry, $502,000 has been proposed to support upgrades to the Integrated Forest Research Information System. Moving on to Public Safety and Veterans, starting with DOC, $4.1 million is included to reflect medical inflation as well as utilization within the correctional facilities. There's a $2 million proposal to purchase a few classroom trailers so that the department can begin offering mobile education classrooms related to HVAC and renewable energy technicians. There's just under $1 million proposed for the Corrections Special Reserve Fund to reflect administration criminal sentencing bills. $935,000 is included for 2 mobile dental teams to begin providing a higher level of service to inmates. And $900,000 is included to continue the expansion of electronic monitoring of probationers. At DCJS, $6.8 million has been included in the first year to increase support for the School Resource Officer Incentive Grant Fund. This would be an increase to $30 million in the first year, in addition to the $20 million included in the second year within Chapter 2. $3.5 million has been proposed for TDO, ECO transportation reimbursements for local law enforcement. The language specifies that these reimbursements would only be for time spent on transportation, not waiting at the facility. There's a proposed grant program for communications infrastructure equipment at localities for public safety. $2.5 million has been included, and the language directs this to localities that both have high fiscal stress and are categorized as double distressed by VEDP. So this would be a little over 50 localities within the Commonwealth. State police, $3.3 million is included in the second year to reflect a pay step increase for their sworn trooper positions. This would be an average of 1.4% across the board. 2.4 million is included to upgrade just over 100 electronic fingerprint machines across the Commonwealth. There's 2.2 million included to continue upgrading the criminal information network. There are a few other notable public safety proposals. The largest two here, first at fire programs, $5 million has been included to support grants to localities for purchasing protective firefighter equipment. And then $3.1 million has been included for DJJ to reflect some increased operating costs related to their admissions activities as well as some of their contract services. Finally, at Veterans and Defense Affairs, at DVS, there's an additional $4.7 million included in the first year for higher than expected startup costs at the new Veterans Care Centers. You all had previously approved $19.1 million last session, so this would bring the total to just under $24 million. There's $1 million for IT upgrades and a proposed line of credit for the Davis and McDaniel Veterans Care Center in Roanoke, which is experiencing some cash flow issues. And finally, at DMA, there's a $12 million line of credit proposed for the federally reimbursable projects. The department is bumping up against some capacity constraints in its current line of credit, and also this would allow them to separate their operating and capital expenses. Next is Michael.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. Moving on to transportation, there are three general fund proposals in the introduced budget related to transportation. The first one is the proposed appropriation of $175 million for I-81, which was earmarked last year contingent on the 24 year-end surplus. The second amendment is a proposal to modify the WMATA operating support that was provided last year. What it did was eliminate the $84.5 million second year appropriation and move $73.4 million of it into the first year, so a net reduction of about $11.1 million based on an updated projection of how much the local share will be and the state match requirement is. And the third proposal is a $1 million appropriation to support a dredging project off of the York River. The next slide just shows the NGF proposals for transportation. Most of them are just technical adjustments related to the forecast and the 6-year plan. The one policy adjust proposal is $25 million for DMV to support replacement of their computer system. There are several language amendments related to toll relief. One is a proposal to modify the language that was adopted last year, which did further toll relief in the Portsmouth and Norfolk area. The language amendment just clarifies that it's only Norfolk and Portsmouth residents that it would be eligible for the toll relief, and the language would also allow borrowing of money from that was provided for the second toll relief program to go to the original one when the original one runs out of money. The language would authorize the transfer. There's also language eliminating the toll on the George P. Coleman Bridge, which is the bridge that connects York County to Gloucester, and the language states that any remaining debt to the state's toll facility revolving account would be written off. Lastly, there are several language amendments, the largest of which is a $20 million authorization for a $20 million state-supported treasury loan for the Roanoke-Blacksburg Regional Airport to do some runway modifications. There's also language at DMV that will allow them to charge a 1.5 convenience fee for large transactions above $10,000. Moving on to compensation actions, last year's budget had a 3.3% 3% salary increase for all employee groups. In each year of the biennium, there's no modifications to that included in the introduced budget. There was also significant targeted saving actions, targeted salary actions included in last year's budget. This year, there are $7.1 million for three smaller targeted salary actions, including the state police pay plan, an adjustment for DBHDS trade staff that Amy mentioned, and $1.4 million for an increase for E911 dispatchers in sheriff's offices. The last thing just shows a table of the benefit changes, the largest which is a $40.5 million for a 6% increase in the state employee health program premiums in the second year. Next, we will move to Andrea.
Good afternoon, everyone. Finishing up on capital and general government, there's $1.4 billion in this budget for capital. That's both the total amount and the general fund amount, because there's a $400 million swap of existing debt for new GF cash. The purple shows the general allocation of these monies in three different ways. One is the majority of it goes to higher ed over state agencies. When you look at it by authorization status, most of it is going for projects that are already in the pipeline. Of the new projects, the majority is for deferred maintenance. Finally, by project type, half of it is for construction and acquisition, which is very typical for what we see because that's where the majority of your costs are. A couple projects I want to bring to your attention. As I just said, half the budget is for construction and acquisition. Most of that's for higher ed. I want to point out this budget does include both planning and construction for Virginia State Police, as well as for other higher ed projects listed on that chart. For existing facility improvements, these are the projects that are a little bit too big to use the agency's ongoing maintenance reserve for, but don't quite fall into the large renovation or construction category. You have about $125 million there. The majority is it for state agencies, and of that, about $50 million is for DBHDS for them to prioritize critical repairs at statewide facilities. The remainder is for improvement projects at institutions of higher ed. For planning, this is where projects would start in the pipeline. So there are three specific projects I want to point out. First is the budget includes funding for a new state agency building in accordance with the study that DGS performed with language that you all put in the budget. They're recommending that the building be at the VDOT Annex, excuse me, and that you sell the property at 7th and Main. There's also funding to continue the new courts building that will go up at Pocahontas. And then of the new projects starting in the pipeline, the one I want to call your attention to the most is the Replace State Lab for DGS. It's a critical project, but it is a very expensive one. You'll all be hosting Bonchi Tewold, the Director of Department of General Services, on Wednesday. She'll go into a little bit more detail on those projects. Finally, in other capital, just two things I want to point out on here. We have about $62 million in cost overruns. Thankfully, we are finally getting a handle on all the COVID impacts on projects, and so this is just for two very specific, unique circumstances. And finally, the $15 million of what we always do when a project's nearing completion, and we're throwing the fixtures, furniture, and equipment there at the end. And then one slide for general government, a few things to bring to your attention. The budget includes $131 million to replace the state's aging tax management system. This is enough money to, we anticipate, to cover the full project cost that will take place over the next 4 to 5 years. Finally, there's some money in central accounts to cover the typical general fund state share for rent, IT cost increases, property insurance. There's also money in the budget to support the Supreme Court for ceiling fee implementation. And with that, Mr. Chair, I turn it back to you.
Okay. Committee members, are there any questions for staff? Delegate Wiley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the folks presenting. On page 34, Labor and Commerce, can you educate me on the economic situation there? You mentioned, if I can get back to it, economic development project has stalled. Is that the Wythe County project?
Yes, Delegate Wiley, there was a project that we incentivized, I believe it was in 2021, for Blue Star Manufacturing to locate its operations in Wythe County. That economic development incentive included $8.5 million for the county to do upgrades at Progress Park for the company. In that time, they were going to capitalize their efforts with a large federal grant, but those federal funds did not come through, and the company does not look like it's going to be successful. But the county had already spent the $3.9 million on the upgrades, and we're under obligation to get that money to the county. Under our contract with the company, we will be likely to get that money back due to the clawback provisions as a part of that economic development deal.
Thank you. Appreciate the information. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any other questions from the committee members? If not, that concludes our meeting for this afternoon. Committee shall rise. Thank you.